Hello friends, what's up? It's Jaime here, and welcome to another episode of Rewriting Minecraft Diaries. As a veteran Minecraft Diaries fangirl and former theorist who has never moved on from anything in her life, I decided that I wanted to take a crack at creating an outline for how I would rewrite Minecraft Diaries. The full series playlist is linked down below in the description. Last episode was about Menfia the Fury, and in today's episode we are finally talking about our final divine warrior, Kulzak the Wanderer. I know, it only took us 4 episodes, but we are finally here. We are finally talking about Kulzak. But before we get into today's episode, I first wanted to go over some notes from the last episode, starting with Halone, Menthia's sister, who, in case you are just tuning in and you haven't watched the last episode, is a new character. Halone is not from the original Minecraft Diaries story, in case you're like, who is that? I don't remember her. It's because she's an original character that I created for the purpose of this rewrite. In the last episode, as I was talking about Halone, I somehow forgot to mention that she is Menthia's older sister. I just kept referring to her as Menthia's sister, but I never actually distinguished if she was older or younger, so here is that. And since Halone is a character that I created, she obviously does not have a character model from the original story, so I also wanted to give a general description of her. She has a pretty similar appearance to Menfia, as they are sisters, same skin tone, same armor, but instead of having red hair and purple eyes like Menfia, she had brown hair and light blue eyes. Which leads me to my next point, which is less of a note and more of a question for you guys, because up until this point, I haven't really gone into much detail of like any of the character designs for any of the characters that we have discussed so far. And so I guess my question for you guys is just, would you like an episode where I talk more about my ideas for the designs of the Minecraft Diaries characters for this rewrite? Because I don't have like super drastic, like dramatic reimagined designs in mind, but I do have some ideas. And so I would basically just like put together some references from like Pinterest, because I am not an artist. I cannot draw to save my fucking life. It's why I commission artists for my own projects, and I would love to work with an artist to reimagine the designs of the Minecraft Diaries characters at some point in this series. But for the time being, I would just want to do what I do for my own projects, which is like create Pinterest boards or something like that for the characters. So yeah, let me know if that's something that you guys would be interested in. But anyway, back to the actual like notes. When Menfia decided that she wanted to remove her relic and seal it away, I just wanted to add that the extraction process of Menfia's relic was very painful and taxing on her body, because the relic was so deeply enmeshed. I don't know why that word is sounding weird to me right now, but it was so like such a deep part of like her sense of self. When we discuss future relic holders in a later part of this series, I'll talk a bit more about relic compatibility and how it affects the relic holder when they possess a relic and when it's extracted. And then for the actual sealing of her relic, the seal works very similar to how Enki's seal for like all the confessionals that he left in like his various temples work. Only someone with the power of a relic can access it, and Enki created the seal for Menfia, since Menfia no longer had the power of her relic after, it was removed. Yeah, okay, that's everything for now. So without further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, Kulzak the Wanderer. In this rewrite, Kulzak is the third divine warrior to have met Irene. Kulzak, out of all of the divine warriors, definitely had the most unorthodox first meeting with Irene, because when Kulzak first encountered Irene, he had conspired to kill her. Now, this might feel a little reminiscent of Irene and Shad's first meeting, but while Shad was hostile to Irene initially, he hadn't intended to kill her. Kulzak, on the other hand, was a different story. When he met Irene, Kulzak had long been a traveling mercenary in Rouen. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, so long as the payment was sufficient. As long as his pockets were filled, he didn't really care about the people that he might be hurting in the process. Kulzak took on an array of jobs, including, but not limited to, targeting and destroying the people of Rouen attempts to grow food and harvest their own food, so that the townspeople would have to rely on the food from the kingdom suppliers that the king could withhold at any time to ensure obedience and loyalty, smuggling illegal goods, acting as a hitman, whether for the king or other shady clients. As far as Kulzak was concerned, he was just making the king system work for him. It wasn't his fault that other people weren't doing the same. And no, he didn't necessarily agree with the imperialism or all the deliberate starvation and torture that the king was doing to get the people to bend to his will. But Kulzak was like, this is just the way of the world. There's no need for me to get all bent out of shape over things that I can't change. Now, when Kulzak first heard about Irene, it wasn't even like he had this burning hatred of her or anything for challenging the system that he was directly profiting from. It was more like he was just very wary and distrustful of her and her intentions. He couldn't fathom that there could possibly be someone who would go to such lengths to help other people at the risk of her own personal safety, because Kulzak had grown up in the business of you're the only person you can trust. After all, his own father, who had raised him as a mercenary, had ultimately sold him out to smugglers after a job went south so that he could escape. And Kulzak never saw his father again after that. That was when Kulzak learned that he was the only person that he could rely on. Loyalties and allegiances, they could change at the drop of a hat. And so to survive, Kulzak had to learn to adapt. He became very individualistic as a result. This was not to say that he never worked with other people. Some jobs that he took on did require extra help, but Kulzak became a pro at knowing when to cut off loose ends to save his own skin. Now, as I have discussed in previous episodes, as Irene went from being merely a thorn in the king's side to a real threat to his power, he put out a substantial bounty for Irene's head, and many mercenaries and bounty hunters alike attempted to collect on this bounty. But as Irene rose to prominence and her group of powerful allies grew in size, it became increasingly difficult for anyone to even get near Irene. At this point in time, Irene was only traveling herself with Xavier, Shad, and Esmond, but they were still an extremely formidable group to be reckoned with, just the four of them. There was a reason why none of the attempts on Irene's life had been successful, and Kulzak was aware of this when he teamed up with a group of mercenaries to make their own attempt. Now, initially, Kulzak said no when he was approached by them. Not because he had any kind of moral epiphany or because he didn't want in on the bounty. He definitely did, even if he needed to split it, because it was a pretty substantial bounty. But because he was not convinced that this group's attempt was going to be any different than anyone else's attempt. After all, literally every other attempt on Irene's life had failed so far, clearly. And it was clear to everyone at this point that Irene and her group were not ordinary people. Yes, they weren't the divine warriors yet, but they were still all extremely skilled fighters with unique abilities that far outclassed the average mercenary or Kingsguard. Irene and her group had once outmatched a group of over 50 assailants all on their own. So what would make this attempt any different? It wasn't that Kulzak thought that Irene and her group were invincible, far from it, but he knew that any common effort to attack Irene with brute force was pretty much doomed to fail. Kulzak felt that it was much more likely that eventually human nature would catch up to Irene. She would run out of hiding spots in Rouen, or someone would leak information about her location or movements to get the king's favor. Then the king's guards, with collectively more firepower and infinitely more resources, would find and execute her. That was the way the world worked. The strong and the powerful crushed the weak. And again, while Kulzak was well aware that Irene and her group could hardly be considered weak, the king just had more power overall. So you may be asking, what was it then that convinced Kulzak to join in on this specific assassination attempt? Well, it was because this group, the Silver Sights, that had approached Kulzak were a little smarter than the average mercenary or bounty hunter. They explained to Kulzak that their plan wasn't to charge in guns a-blazing. Instead, they sought to draw Irene out by setting fire to a nearby village, located in the northern part of Rouen, in the area that would eventually become home to villages Metelli, Brightport, and Phoenix Drop. The Silver Sights had received reliable intel that Irene and her group were in the area. And so their plan was to set fire to this village and force Irene into a situation where she and her group would be so preoccupied with protecting other people that they wouldn't be able to focus on protecting Irene. After all, it was clear from the intel that they had collected that Irene valued the lives of civilians more than she cared about her own personal safety. And when Kulzak heard this, he couldn't help but admit that this wasn't a completely terrible plan. Not only would they have the element of surprise due to the chaos of the fire, but again, it wasn't unrealistic for Irene to forego her own well-being to help people in need. It would be a good way to take advantage of Irene's supposed good nature. Kulzak post joining Irene would absolutely have abhorred this comparison, but Kulzak pre-Irene was actually the most similar to Shad. Kulzak initially doubted the legitimacy of Irene's good nature because, as I previously stated, Kulzak had essentially lived his whole life with the expectation that no matter how well-intentioned and kind someone appeared to be, they would always disappoint you when it mattered. Kulzak felt that this plan with the Silver Sides would go one of two ways. Either Irene would die trying to protect the villagers, or she would abandon the village to save herself once it was revealed that all this was orchestrated to kill her. Because the Silver Sides were well aware that it was unlikely that they'd be able to hide the truth about the fire once they started attacking, because it's just like, why are all these people attacking? And Irene and her group were not dumb, so they'd likely be able to put the pieces together. Either way, though, Irene would die, or her public image of being the selfless savior and protector of the innocent would be shattered, which would essentially be like a social death, and thus make it much easier for future attempts to collect the bounty if Irene's supporters started turning on her. And so, Kulzak was convinced and decided to team up with the Silver Sides. The Silver Sides' plan went disturbingly well. The fire ravaged the village, and Irene and her group jumped in to help them without hesitation. Their efforts to help the villagers were organized and effective, and if it weren't for the fact that the Silver Sides were lying in wait to strike, everyone likely would have gotten out relatively unscathed. But unfortunately, the Silver Sides were lying in wait to attack. And between the chaos of the fire, the Silver Sides attacking and killing some of the villagers, and then also attacking Irene and her group, Irene was separated from the others. And as luck would have it, it was Kulzak who cornered Irene in a burning house. At this point, Irene had depleted quite a bit of her magics, healing the villagers, so she was not at her full strength, and she was holding a baby boy that she had entered the house to rescue. Kulzak knew that this was likely going to be his only chance, but before he could strike her down, Irene asked him to promise her that he would take the baby to safety after he killed her, like verbatim. Kulzak was struck with how resolved Irene looked. She didn't seem scared or distressed about what was happening, but calm. The only thing that she was concerned about was Kulzak getting this child to safety. And it was at that moment that Kulzak realized that Irene was not like other people. And it wasn't because of her powers, it was because she actually stood by her convictions and principles. No one but Kulzak would have known if she had decided to run and abandon this child, but she stuck to her morals anyway. Irene didn't just claim to be a good person, she was a good person. And if she could live a principled life, even when things got hard, maybe even someone like Kulzak could too. And so, Kulzak decided to turn against the Silver Sides. He informed Irene of their plans, and together they developed a counter strategy. Kulzak reunited the baby with his mother, while Irene regrouped with Shad, Esmond, and Xavier. Although the Silver Sides definitely outnumbered them, with Kulzak's help, Irene's group was able to put out the fire, save the remaining villagers, and chase the Silver Sides out of the village. And by chase them out of the village, I actually mean that Irene purposefully lured them away by taunting them about the bounty. Listen, I didn't say it was a good counter strategy, but it was a plan. They didn't have Enki yet, cut them a little bit of slack. So now Irene's group, with Kulzak in tow, are on the run from a lot of potential assassins, which leads them to fleeing by sea and sailing north towards Galruk, which is how they wind up on Enki's island. But before they made it to Enki's island, while they're still at sea, Irene now has to explain who Kulzak is and why he's with them, which does not go great, considering that Irene introduced him as a guy who tried to kill her. This was probably one of the only times where Esmond and Shad were actually on the same page about anything. They did not trust Kulzak as far as they could throw him, but Kulzak gave his word that he was no longer affiliated with the Silver Scythes and wanted to turn over a new leaf. He was fully prepared to leave his life as a mercenary behind and join Irene's cause because she made him feel like it was possible, even allowing Shad and Esmond to restrain him while they were at sea as proof of his commitment to not harming Irene. Over time, Kulzak proved himself to be completely loyal to Irene and a trustworthy ally, even befriending Esmond and the other Divine Warriors. Although he and Shad were never close, but they were civil, mostly, at least from Shad's end. But for Irene's sake, Kulzak did make an effort to not be completely rude to Shad all the time. Something about Kulzak that you're gonna learn very quickly is that he doesn't really do nuance or do things halfway. He lives his life in extremes, and I feel like that is going to be very evident with how he handles the events throughout his life and interacts with certain people. So although he still had that gruffness and ruthless edge to him from being a mercenary, when he devoted himself to Irene's cause, he was all in. Kulzak had been so inspired by Irene's commitment to helping others. He revered her. His name is escaping me right now, but if you guys remember, one of the smugglers from Minecraft Diaries Season 2, the ones who were trying to like traffic Zoe, Malachi, and Levin, the one who like completely, he was like threatening Aphmau, and then when she revealed her Irene form, he was like bowing to her, he's like, oh, my lady, Lady Irene. That is what I imagine Kulzak to have been like. For him, meeting Irene was like divine intervention. Again, he still retained like basically his same personality that he had developed as a mercenary, which was especially evident in how he interacted with Shad. But out of all the Divine Warriors, it was clear from the moment that Kulzak joined Irene's cause that he was the most vocal and active of Irene's supporters. And although Kulzak wasn't the smartest or even the strongest of the Divine Warriors, his biggest asset to the group was how he was able to spread Irene's message and convince people to support her and join their cause. It's how Kulzak convinced many of the mercenaries that he knew in Rouen to join them in opposing the king, minus the Silver Scythes, who we will circle back to at a later point in the series, so put a pin in them for now. I've already said this in a previous episode about like the actual rebellion. So Hyria and Menphia invaded Ocassus from the sea with the forces that they gathered from Tula, while Esmond, Kulzak, and Xavier led the forces that they amassed from the former King's Guards and mercenaries that Kulzak knew on the ground. All the while, Irene and Shad confronted the king directly, and Enki gave out orders via a communication amulet in Scaleswind. Following their successful rebellion and the abolition of the monarchy, Kulzak joined the Scaleswind Guard as Esmond's second in command. At this point, it was clear to literally everyone who knew them that Kulzak was in love with Irene. Kulzak was very loud and proud about his feelings for Irene. It hadn't taken him very long for him to develop these feelings after he initially joined the group. Kulzak was very aware of Esmond's feelings for Irene, but the two of them had a very respectful, friendly rivalry, and this didn't disrupt their friendship. But Kulzak was definitely the most forthcoming about his feelings between him and Esmond. Not that Esmond was shy by any means, but Kulzak never hesitated to openly flirt with Irene. Obviously, Irene didn't reciprocate Kulzak's feelings, which, although Kulzak would never have admitted this out loud, he was a little butthurt about it. But even still, Kulzak was still fully committed to helping Irene in any way that he could and protecting her and just all around being there for her. Because not only did he love and have these romantic feelings for her, he also venerated her as this goddess of the world. I'd also just like to make a quick note that in this rewrite, I decided to have Kulzak be in love with Irene in place of Xavier. I did this because I know that in the original Minecraft Diaries, it's Xavier who was like rumored to have been in love with Irene. But so I did this because I really wanted to draw more of a connection and a parallel between Kulzak and Lawrence. So in this rewrite, Xavier isn't in love with Irene, Kulzak is. I've talked about this in the previous episodes about Irene being put on this pedestal, but I need you guys to understand that no one put Irene on a pedestal the way that Kulzak did. His reverence for Irene was on a whole other level. And so you can probably imagine that from how I'm talking about this, that Kulzak's relationship to Irene was definitely the most unhealthy out of all of the Divine Warriors. He wasn't like a full-on creeper towards her, but there was definitely a possessiveness there. Again, in Kulzak's mind, Irene was like this goddess, the savior of the world, his savior. She had saved him from himself, set him down the right path. He didn't think that anyone was truly worthy of being in Irene's presence, not even himself. But of course, that didn't stop him from personally vetting every person Irene came into contact with, every person that he could anyway. Most times he had to actually go do, like, the jobs that Irene assigned him to do. In Kulzak's defense, something that you will not hear me say a lot at all, Irene did have a lot of enemies, so it wasn't like his protectiveness was entirely unwarranted, but Kulzak had this general sense of no one is good enough to be in the presence of Lady Irene, regardless of who they were and what their intentions were. And because of his proximity to Irene, no one really checked Kulzak's attitude about this except for Menthia and Shad. Speaking of Shad, although Kulzak did make somewhat of an effort to play nice, it was abundantly clear to everyone who knew them personally that Kulzak and Shad, they only worked together because of Irene. And if it weren't for Irene, they would have likely never have chosen to associate with each other because they did not like each other at all. If you want my honest opinion about why Kulzak hated Shad so much, I feel like it was due to a lot of Kulzak's own self-hatred. After joining Irene and leaving his life as a mercenary behind, Kulzak had a lot of guilt over the things that he had done in his past. He had done a lot of horrible shit. Like, I kind of mentioned it in the beginning, but there's a lot of other stuff that he did that was not great. So that really fueled his own feelings of feeling like he wasn't worthy of being around Irene. Now, while neither of them would have ever attested to this, Kulzak and Shad, again, were actually very similar people. They had very similar backgrounds of abandonment and having to grow up and survive on their own. In Shad's case, he was cast out because of his magics, but ultimately he came to the realization that there wasn't something wrong with him or that his powers were wrong. It was the way that people treated him that was wrong. And as a result, Shad came to the conclusion that you can't control how people perceive you, but especially after meeting Irene, you can control how you move through life, and to do so in a way that aligns with who you are and what your values are. And after joining Irene, Shad no longer cared what other people thought about him because he was like, I found the people who accept me, and that's enough. I don't need to be liked or loved by everyone. And that was how Shad carried himself. He genuinely did not care if people liked him. He always just did what he wanted. And that really pissed Kulzak off. From Kulzak's perspective, it felt like Shad acted like he was better than everyone, which was not true at all. Shad didn't think that he was better than anyone. He just didn't need the validation of other people to function. Not even Irene. Sure, Shad loved Irene, but he never felt the need to conform or change himself to get her or anyone to like him. But honestly, that just pissed Kulzak off even more because he cared a lot, like a lot, about how he was perceived, particularly because of his shady past. Kulzak was extremely insecure, and so he projected a lot of those insecurities onto Shad. Again, likely because they had the most similar backgrounds. Kulzak had a bit of an inferiority complex when it came to Irene, and it was like the more that he raised Irene up and put her on this pedestal, the more he felt the need to put himself and others down because he was like, Irene is perfect. whereas the rest of us are lowly mortals who should consider ourselves lucky to breathe the same air as her, and we shouldn't dare to consider ourselves equal to her in any way. You know, totally the mindset of a mentally well and healthy and well adjusted person. And so anyone who was too confident or too self assured or wasn't entirely dependent on external validation or acceptance felt like a threat to Kulzak. A threat to himself because he was like, I hate myself, so why don't you also hate yourself? You must be the weird one. And a threat to Irene because a person who is a little too confident might get the idea that they're on the same level or better than Irene. And we simply could not have that. This is really what was at the root of Kulzak's conflict with Shad, regardless of whether he was always like consciously aware of it or not, but he would consistently try to humble Shad and bring Shad down throughout the entirety of them knowing each other. It's also why Kulzak would increasingly butt heads with Menfia as the years went on, because she was very confident in herself and her abilities and would often push back against Irene when she felt that it was necessary. And then also in Shad's case, the fact that Irene chose Shad over him just made Kulzak despise him even more. Kulzak was very open about his jealousy and disdain of Irene and Shad's relationship to everyone who wasn't Irene. He didn't want to come across as questioning her choices to her face, but that didn't stop him from complaining and questioning her choosing Shad to anyone who made the mistake of asking him what was wrong. Kulzak went from being a little butthurt over Irene's rejection, but still okay with her decision, to extremely butthurt when Irene and Shad's relationship was revealed. He was like, she chose him? Really? Of all people? Which definitely spilled into how he interacted with Irene and Shad's daughter. Kulzak was never explicitly rude to Irene and Shad's daughter, but he certainly didn't have the same close relationship that Shad and the other Divine Warriors had with her. Kulzak had never been a big fan of kids in the first place, and she was also Shad's daughter, and similar to how Irene secretly felt, he felt like her daughter was holding her back and getting in the way of her being the savior that the world needed. Again, Kulzak was never outright mean to Irene and Shad's daughter, but he was consistently brushing her off and generally pretty cold towards her. This was actually the biggest issue that Shad had with Kulzak, that Kulzak was Irene's number one ass kisser. But because Kulzak never actually did anything to his daughter, Shad never felt the need to really step in and do anything. This probably goes without saying, but Shad never initiated conflicts with Kulzak if he could help it, because despite not liking him, he knew that Irene had a lot of faith and trust in Kulzak. She trusted him deeply. Kulzak was Esmond's second in command after all, and he would often accompany Irene when she traveled to other villages to mitigate their conflicts. And in general, Shad never felt threatened by Kulzak. He was like, Irene is a grown woman. I can't tell her who to surround herself with. So he didn't. When Irene brought forth news about the threats of the Comet and the Void, presenting her friends with the relics, Kulzak readily accepted the burden of the relic. Ever since he had first joined Irene, Kulzak had been fully prepared to do whatever he needed to do to serve her. The burden of the relic's power was a small price to pay. Now, like I have mentioned in previous episodes, receiving the relics changed how the Divine Warriors viewed themselves and the world. It affected them all in different ways, to varying degrees, but Kulzak undeniably got it the worst, because not only did his relic intensify his inferiority complex, it also gave him a superiority complex. Yay! Like Irene and Esmond, Kulzak viewed himself as a necessary protector of the realm following the acquisition of his relic, but make no mistake, Kulzak still firmly believed in the hierarchy of Irene is the perfect goddess of the world and everyone else is beneath her, but the enhanced physical strength, speed, and durability that his relic provided him with made Kulzak feel a little bit closer to Irene's level of power. Unlike the other Divine Warriors, Kulzak didn't question where the relics came from and fully believed Irene when she said that she had discovered them. And while Kulzak felt saddened for Irene when her daughter disappeared, he of course never suspected that Irene herself had been responsible. Kulzak and Menthia assisted Shad in pushing back the void, while Irene wielded the celestial cannon to destroy the comet with Esmond and Enki, as I have discussed in previous episodes. Kulzak was hardly pleased with being forced to work with Shad in such a close capacity, but for all his grumbling and complaining, when there was a crisis, Kulzak knew when to put his personal feelings aside and lock in. And believe it or not, Kulzak did actually feel some sympathy for Shad, who was clearly grieving the loss of his daughter. He wasn't completely heartless after all. Just mostly. What? Who said that? In any case, after the comet had been destroyed and the void had been dealt with, everyone had kind of clocked that something was up with Irene. Everyone except for Kulzak. Kulzak was insistent that everyone was imagining that something was going on with Irene because surely, if something was actually wrong, Irene would have said something, right? And Kulzak grew increasingly more annoyed and frustrated as Menthia, Enki, and Esmond kept trying to probe answers out of Irene. He was basically like, why are you guys trying to bother her over nothing? You're making a big deal out of literally nothing. Of course, Shad would ultimately confront Irene himself and the truth of everything would come out, and as it would turn out, it was not nothing. As I've gone through these episodes and talked about each of the Divine Warriors' reactions to what Irene had done, they've all been at least a little bit on some, like, in some way, horrified. Can you guess who was the outlier? Kulzak was the first person to not only defend Irene's actions, but to applaud her for having the courage and conviction to do what needed to be done, to make this unimaginable decision that no normal person would have been able to do. And Shad was like, you got one part right. No normal person, no good person, would have been able to do what Irene had done to their daughter and all those other people. Yeah, Shad had some choice words for Kulzak, for all the Divine Warriors really, with the exception of Menthia of course, but especially for Kulzak. Shad was done mincing his words and biting his tongue. His baby girl was gone. Nothing mattered anymore. He had zero fucks left to give, so he really ripped into Kulzak. But the thing that Shad said that really struck a nerve was when he told Kulzak that maybe he'd finally have a chance with Irene now that she has revealed herself to be as disgusting as he was. Which, as I'm sure you can imagine, really pissed Kulzak off. He was more offended on Irene's behalf than for himself, but also still offended for himself. Shad knew exactly how to hit Kulzak where it hurt, and it was abundantly clear during that confrontation. Kulzak had some choice words of his own for Shad, but none of them really landed because Shad had never cared what Kulzak, of all people, thought about him, and he certainly didn't care what the Irene apologist had to say now. Truth be told, if Kulzak really wanted to say something that would have gotten under, like, Shad's skin and really struck a nerve, he would have said something about his daughter, but not even Kulzak was willing to stoop so low. Not that this should be applauded, I'm just pointing out that even Kulzak had lines that he wouldn't cross. So Shad defects and Irene is depressed as hell. Kulzak does everything that he can to comfort and help her, constantly reassuring her that she made the right choice. She was a hero. She had saved the world from total annihilation. She shouldn't beat herself up for doing the right thing, and it's not her fault that Shad couldn't understand the weight of the choice she had to make. But nothing Kulzak, Esmond, or Enki did was able to prevent Irene from losing her ability to love. And for Kulzak, that was the last straw. Honestly, he had wanted to kill Shad the moment he defected. Probably longer than that if we're being completely honest, but he didn't out of respect for Irene. In reality, it was also because Menthia, Esmond, and Enki had stopped him, but Kulzak's burning hatred of Shad had finally reached its, like, boiling point, and he decided that he couldn't let Shad walk free. Kulzak considered Shad abandoning Irene as the ultimate transgression. and that Shad needed to pay for what he had done with his life. Because how dare he? Who did he think he was walking out on Irene after everything she had done for him? He would have been nothing without her. It would be irresponsible too for Kulzak, both as Irene's guard and as a divine warrior, to let Shad walk free. Shad had shown himself to be unstable and dangerous with how he spoke to Irene and the other divine warriors when he defected. There was no telling what he might do now that he was a free agent. He might try to physically harm Irene or her supporters, or he might try to stain her legacy, twisting the events of what happened to make Irene look like this villain to fit his biased narrative. Surely, Kulzak couldn't just wait around for that to happen, and so Kulzak spearheaded the plot to kill Shad, convincing Esmond and Enki to join him. As you will recall from the last episode, Kulzak was unable to convince Menfia to join them, and as a result, she left the Divine Warriors as well. Now, Kulzak was furious with Menfia for leaving, but he couldn't dwell on that for too long. He had an assassination to plan. As we know now, Menfia had told Shad about the assassination plot unbeknownst to the remaining Divine Warriors, and so Shad was able to get in the first strike. This marked the official beginning of the War of the Magi. As I previously mentioned, the war was long and brutal. The sheer scale of their battles forced Irene to throw Shad into different realms because they were really tearing shit up in the overworld, especially because Shad refused to go quietly. He knew that the odds weren't really in his favor since it was 4-1, but Shad was determined to exhaust the Divine Warriors, both physically and mentally, as much as he could. At this point, of course, Irene is involved, not because she wants to be, and she made sure to let the remaining Divine Warriors know that she was not happy about this at all, but because she felt responsible for the war, that it was her problem to solve. And it's ultimately because of Irene that Shad is defeated, with the final battle taking place in her dimension. Though Shad's defeat did absolutely nothing to bring Irene any kind of peace, it only worsened her depression because not only was she now grieving Shad's death, she was also mourning over what he had become with his transformation into the Shadow Lord. And not long after that, Shad started the Human Wyvern War. After the Human Wyvern War had concluded and it was glaringly obvious that Irene's mental state and emotional state were only worsening, Kulzak began to obsess over where he had gone wrong. In this period, following the fallout of the War of the Magi and the Human Wyvern War, Kulzak was really experiencing a lot of cognitive dissonance because he had essentially started the War of the Magi for Irene, or at least in his mind, he had done this for Irene, when in reality, not only did Kulzak not consult Irene, he deliberately hid his plans from her and instructed Esmond and Enki to do the same because Kulzak knew that if Irene found out what they were planning to do to Shad, she would have never signed off on it and would have stopped him. But this is how Kulzak would operate for the rest of his life. He would always say that he was doing things for Irene, that he had her best interest at heart, that making her happy and preserving her legacy were the only things that mattered to him. But that wasn't really true because Irene, for all of her flaws, never asked him to do any of this. She never asked him to destroy records of Shad and have any remaining records rewritten to emphasize his villainy and make herself, and by extension the other Divine Warriors, look more benevolent and heroic. She didn't tell Kulzak to threaten Menfia into silence about what had happened with Shad and the relics and everything, or have his followers root out anyone who opposed her. Hell, she certainly didn't ask him to kill Shad. It didn't actually make Irene happy for Kulzak to do any of this, and she told him so on numerous occasions, albeit she didn't tell him when it came to the other things, not the killing Shad thing, obviously that already happened. But with the other things, she didn't tell him to stop either, but it was abundantly clear that Irene was only becoming more withdrawn and numb to everything, which wasn't directly the result of Kulzak's actions, but nothing that Kulzak was doing was helping her either. And again, Irene didn't want Kulzak to do the things that he was doing, but he continued to do them anyway, thus the cognitive dissonance. So Kulzak's way of dealing with this cognitive dissonance was for him to double down and continue repeatedly to insist that everything he did was for Irene, that he knew what she really wanted, even if she had explicitly told him otherwise, because otherwise he would have to confront that doing horrible things in Irene's name was still him doing horrible things, even if he fully believed that by acting on Irene's behalf that he had the moral high ground. And it was ultimately this, Kulzak's inability to admit that what he had done and was continuing to do was wrong. Plotting to kill Shad, actually killing Shad, destroying records of him, threatening Menthia and anyone who remotely opposed Irene in any capacity into silence or submission that cost him all of his close relationships. Up until the War of the Magi, Kulzak and Esmond had always been very close friends. They considered each other like brothers. Even with their rivalry over their feelings for Irene, they still had this very strong bond. In Kulzak's mind, Esmond was the only other suitable candidate for Irene's affections, besides himself, of course. But after the War of the Magi, their friendship took a massive hit. Esmond expressed a lot of regret over killing Shad, and while he did initially assist Kulzak in destroying records of him, he got sick of it and Kulzak pretty quickly. Esmond called Kulzak out on his hypocrisy, because if literally anyone else dared to claim that they knew Irene's will and what she wanted better than anyone else, even Irene herself, Kulzak would have been the first person to be like, oh, they're just a mere mortal who doesn't deserve to breathe the same air as Lady Irene. So what made Kulzak special? What made him any different than that? Esmond pointed out that it felt less like Kulzak was trying to do what was best for Irene and instead was using Irene as a shield to do whatever he wanted. Kulzak, of course, did not appreciate that accusation and ended their friendship. Kulzak and Esmond's falling out is what precipitated the official disbanding of the Divine Warriors. Kulzak attempted to remain in contact with Enki after that, but when he too refused to indulge in Kulzak's fantasy that he and his followers demanding absolute loyalty to Irene from basically everyone and rewriting the story of Shad and the Divine Warriors was what Irene wanted, Kulzak cut Enki loose too. Kulzak had never been close with Hyria, and from the last episode, we know how things ended between him and Menthia. And as for Xavier, he did work closely with him, especially after Esmond retired from the Scaleswind Guard and Kulzak became the head guard in his place, but they were never particularly close friends, although Kulzak would occasionally reach out to him following his own resignation from the Scaleswind Guard. But what was ultimately the final nail in the coffin for Kulzak, the biggest hit that he took, was when even Irene essentially told him to fuck off. She didn't use those exact words, but she basically told him that while he would always be important to her, she no longer needed his services. This is when Kulzak stepped down from the Scaleswind Guard. Kulzak would spend the rest of his life traveling the world to spread the teachings of Irene and mobilizing his followers, many of which were mercenaries or former mercenaries, to do the same. It's no coincidence that in the present story, the most devout Irene followers are also Kulzak followers, and like that smuggler guy whose name is still escaping me, there are a lot of shady characters amongst Kulzak's following. Not all of them, of course, but for a substantial chunk of people with either criminal or shady pasts, if there's a divine warrior that they do worship, it's likely Kulzak. Although many of his followers have been very careful to reframe Kulzak's mercenary affiliations in the centuries that followed, it's how Kulzak got the title of the Wanderer in the first place. It's like the PR-friendly version of Kulzak the mercenary, or Kulzak the criminal. Also, I alluded to this briefly earlier in the episode, but in this rewrite, Lawrence is Kulzak's descendant. It was something that I theorized about back in the day, but in this rewrite, it's like confirmed. Kulzak was eventually laid to rest on the island where the remnants of the Celestial Cannon are located. I feel like Kulzak being laid to rest on the eventual Phoenix Alliance island perfectly encapsulates the overarching story of his life. Kulzak dedicated his life to Irene in every way. His entire world revolved around her. So it's a fitting end that Kulzak's tomb is located under the temple that inspired Irene for the design of her dimension. Kulzak spent the remainder of his life protecting Irene's legacy, and even in death, there was this strong association with her. Alright, that is all I have for today's episode of Rewriting Minecraft Diaries. Thank you guys so much for watching. In the next episode, we're going to take a little break from talking about individual characters, and instead we're going to talk about the physical world of Minecraft Diaries, meaning the 3 regions, Ruan, Galruk, and Tula. I think it's important that we get a lay of the land, pun intended, and get ourselves reacquainted with the villages that we know from the original Minecraft Diaries and introduce some new ones. If all goes well, that episode should be out in October. Life got really busy for me this past month, so this episode came out a lot later than I had originally planned for, but rest assured, I am working hard to make sure that I produce the best episodes I possibly can, and I never want to rush to finish a script that I don't feel is ready and thus put out a video that I don't feel is ready. So I really thank you guys so much for your patience. And I also want to say hi to all the new subscribers who have been coming in. I have been seeing like all the love you guys have been showing on like the past episodes too, and it means so much to me. Thank you guys so much. It makes me so happy, and I am so happy that you guys are enjoying this series. Once again, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I upload Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, except when I don't, except when I disappear for like a month, but never mind that. I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.